As we come to Mass this weekend, we're mindful that we find ourselves now at the observance of Labor Day in our nation. And while to the majority that may mean the traditional end of the summer vacation season and thus a return to schools and jobs, officially the observance seeks to call our attention to work itself and to all who must engage in work in order to earn their living, that they would enjoy conditions at work suitable to their human dignity, conditions which assure their safety, and that all workers would be paid a just wage, that is, one that does allow them to make their living. And so those thoughts should accompany our prayers this weekend, that God would be the guarantor of the success of all who, out of a deep sense of justice, would promote and insist on these ideals, not only for themselves, but for all who must work for their living. Yet some among us don't work. Perhaps we are not yet of an age to do so, and are still in preparation for what our future work will be. Or likely, many of us are already past that age to work, and having done our time in the daily grind, we are more than happy to be enjoying retirement, while of course still empathizing with those in the workplace or engaged in our former professions. Yet while Labor Day calls our attention to jobs, to professions, to careers, from whatever point of view we may be looking at them, preparing for them, presently active in them, or now retired from them, what is missing in all of this is a focus on vocation. And if we have been baptized, we all have a vocation. And while we may be endlessly preparing to be better at it, as we should, we are never able to say we are retired from it until the day we draw our last breath. Indeed, vocation is found in the states of life and the varied works that result from the call of God given to all of us at baptism without any exception. The call to love God with all our mind, heart, and soul, and then to try to love others as much, if not even more, than we actually love ourselves. So in order to keep those two great commandments, which summarize all the rest, we will have to know and take extra care not to violate any of the 10. Many try to write Jesus off as being all for love, but not so interested in law. But that is a quite incorrect oversimplification. Because any breaking of the 10 Commandments, if we look at them carefully, is either a failure to love God or a failure to love our neighbor. In that first reading this morning, Moses, as God's agent, God who is the lawgiver, commends the commandments to the people of Israel and tells them to be very careful in observing them so as to fulfill their role in the world, which is to reveal the wisdom of the living God compared to the lack thereof evident in the empty idols worshipped by the people who are neighboring them in the Middle East. So the vocation of all Israelites, and our vocation, if we understand it, is to live a life that shows evidence that we are just and righteous. And we must stop and realize that those are technical terms in terms of their biblical understanding, and that they both mean law-abiding. And so, coincidentally, our second reading today came to us from St. James. Not James, the brother of John, not James, the son of Alphaeus, James, the brother of the Lord, whose name or nickname by which he's remembered is James the Just. And it's not coincidental that his father, Joseph, is always referred to as the just man. So abiding by the law was important to the family of Jesus. It is thus how we will give good example to those who don't believe as we do, in the hope that they will take notice and be attracted by our manner of life and the charity and mercy and peace that should characterize it as people who observe the commandments of God, and so hopefully inspire them to join in this life with us. So if that is justice and righteousness, and the Pharisees were the most strictly law-abiding of all the Jewish parties in the days of Jesus, then we should ask, why does Jesus seem to have such problems with them? And the answer is before us today. Because they have ended up doing what in our first reading Moses explicitly warns the Israelites not to do, which is to have added to the commandments and thus undermined the priority with which the real commandments should be taken and observed. This tradition of the elders that we hear referred to in this gospel passage was a body of writings, and it was being promoted by the Pharisees. And they fault Jesus for violating this set of rules and customs, mostly consisting of kosher hygiene and dietary regulations that had been built up apart from the law of Moses, and according to the complaint of Jesus, were often being given much more serious attention than even observances of the commandments themselves. Honestly, this is what can and does happen in religious circles at times, but Jesus is clearly disapproving of the overemphasis on these rules, seeing them as superfluous regulations, and calling on those who promote and insist on their observance to wake up and refocus on the bigger picture and get back on track with the commandments. No more insisting on minutiae while neglecting substance. So then, while we are unlikely to be focused on hand washing or the separation of different foods on different plates or paying tithes on various herbs and spices, we should look and honestly admit that we are not immune from creating various practices, from novenas to chaplets, harmless in themselves, but then we can be guilty of promoting them not merely as good for those who find meaning in them, but rather insisting on them as something absolutely essential to the holiness of everyone. This is where Jesus would challenge us, just as he challenged the Pharisees, and ask us not to emphasize pious practices at the expense of truly righteous living, that is, living first and foremost in accord with the commandments of God. For that is how we are meant to stand out among the nations, stand out in what is increasingly amoral or immoral culture, and attract the interest of those not yet in our company or those who have fallen away from it. And hopefully be able to persuade them to join us. So let us all revisit the 10 Commandments. Let us commit or recommit them to our memory, so that understanding all their implications and letting them move from our mind to our hearts with the full depth of all that they require, let that permeate our attitudes and influence all our speech and action, so that we can continue to fulfill the demands of our vocation, which we can never forget is the work of our very lives for our entire lives, from our baptism to our death. Something then that needs to be examined and re-examined, further perfected and more fully practiced each and every day, with the assurance that on the final day when we retire, ours will be a heavenly rest.